Do you remember the first time someone told you King Solomon was the wisest man who ever lived? That he had 700 wives and 300 concubines, and God was perfectly fine with it? That he built a temple so magnificent angels wept? That God himself chose him above all men? I remember sitting in Sunday school, 7 years old, hearing how Solomon was blessed beyond measure, how he could speak to animals, how queens traveled thousands of miles just to hear him speak, how God loved him so much that he offered him anything in the world, and Solomon chose wisdom instead of wealth. Beautiful story. Inspiring story. The kind of story that makes a child believe that goodness is rewarded, that God has favorites, that wisdom is the ultimate treasure. Completely impossible story. And there's a man who proved it. A Jewish philosopher who was excommunicated, cursed, and expelled from his own community for daring to say out loud what the rabbis already knew but would never admit. His name was Baruch Spinoza, and in 1670, while most of Europe was still burning heretics and banning books, he published a work so dangerous that it was immediately prohibited across the continent, burned in public squares, and hidden in secret libraries for generations. Why? Because Spinoza did something unforgivable. He read the Bible. Not the way you were taught to read it. Not with faith closing your eyes to contradictions. Not with tradition explaining away impossibilities. Not with priests telling you what each verse really meant. He read it the way you'd read any other ancient text. With logic. With evidence. With brutal honesty. With the same critical eye you'd use to examine claims about Alexander the Great or Julius Caesar. And what he found about Solomon was so absurd, so contradictory, so obviously fabricated, that it unravels the entire narrative you were raised to believe. Now, I need to tell you something before we continue. This is not for people who want their childhood memories protected. This is not for people who think asking questions is a sin. This is not for people who believe that doubt is the opposite of faith. After you hear what Spinoza discovered, you won't be able to pretend you didn't know anymore. You won't be able to sit through sermons about Solomon's wisdom without seeing the contradictions. You won't be able to read those passages without noticing what doesn't add up, what makes absolutely no sense. But if you've ever felt that something about Solomon's story didn't add up, if you've ever wondered how a man blessed by God could die worshiping demons, if you've ever questioned why the wisest man in history made the stupidest decisions imaginable, if you've ever felt guilty for having those doubts, then you're exactly where you need to be. Because I'm going to show you 7 impossibilities. 7 truths so ridiculous, so demonstrably false, that they cannot be real. 7 things they hid from you. 7 contradictions they told you were mysteries. 7 reasons Spinoza was cursed and hunted for telling the truth. So stay with me. And if this resonates with you, if this gives you even a small piece of freedom from the guilt you've carried, type your location below. Let's see how many of us are finally breaking this silence. Amsterdam, 1656. A young Jewish lens grinder named Baruch Spinoza stood before the elders of his synagogue. He was 23 years old, brilliant, respectful, terrified. The rabbis had summoned him to answer for dangerous questions he'd been asking in private. Questions about Moses. Questions about miracles. Questions about whether the Bible was actually written by the people it claimed to be written by. They'd heard reports. Members of his study group had talked. Word had spread that this young man, this promising scholar from a respected family, was teaching ideas that undermined everything the community believed. They offered him money to stay quiet, a pension, respect, a guaranteed income for life. a place in the community. All he had to do was stop asking questions in public. Stop teaching his ideas to others. Pretend he believed what they needed him to believe. Think about that. They didn't even ask him to actually believe it, just to pretend, just to keep his doubts private, just to maintain the appearance of orthodoxy. He refused. And so they destroyed him. They didn't just excommunicate him, they cursed him. In a ceremony that lasted over an hour, they declared that he should be damned by day and damned by night. Damned when he lies down and damned when he rises up. Damned when he goes out and damned when he comes in. They forbade any Jew from speaking to him, from sheltering him, from reading his words, from doing business with him, or even coming within 4 cubits of his presence. His own family sat Shiva for him as if he were dead. His mother had already passed, but his father's family turned their backs on him completely. They mourned him as if he'd died. He was 23 years old, and he spent the rest of his short life alone, grinding lenses to survive, writing in secret, publishing anonymously, knowing that every word he put on paper brought him closer to violence or death. He died at 44, probably from lung disease caused by inhaling glass dust from his work. Poor, alone, with only a handful of friends who dared to visit him. His books were still banned across Europe. His name was still cursed in synagogues. Churches had added his works to their lists of prohibited texts. Why did they fear him so much? Why did both Jewish and Christian authorities want him silenced? Why couldn't they just ignore one solitary philosopher grinding lenses in a small room? Because Spinoza had discovered something that religious authorities have always known but never admitted publicly. The Bible is not a unified, divinely dictated text handed down from heaven. It's a collection of documents written by different people, at different times, in different languages, for different political purposes. And once you see the seams, once you notice the contradictions, once you apply basic logic to the narratives, the entire structure collapses. And nowhere does it collapse more spectacularly, more completely than in the story of King Solomon. Spinoza didn't approach Solomon's story with reverence. He approached it the way a detective approaches a crime scene. He asked simple questions. He compared texts. He looked for contradictions. He traced political motivations. And what he found were 7 impossibilities so obvious, so ridiculous, that the entire legend falls apart the moment you examine it honestly. Let me show you what they hid from you. The first impossible truth is the 1,000 women lie. 700 wives, 300 concubines, 1,000 women. And the Bible presents this as if God himself blessed Solomon with it, as if having 1,000 women was evidence of divine favor. But Spinoza asked a simple question that nobody in the pulpit ever asks. What does 1,000 women actually mean? Not symbolically, not spiritually, not as some poetic expression of abundance. Practically, logistically, economically. 1,000 women means 1,000 separate palaces, or at minimum 1,000 separate royal apartments, because princesses don't share rooms. 1,000 sets of personal servants, because foreign princesses don't clean their own chambers or cook their own food. 1,000 dowries that would need to be paid to foreign kings as part of marriage alliances. 1,000 political relationships to manage simultaneously across dozens of different kingdoms. 1,000 women means at least 2,000 servants just to maintain their households. Cooks to prepare meals according to different cultural dietary requirements. Cleaners to maintain their living spaces. Guards to protect them. Administrators to manage their affairs. Messengers to communicate with their families. You'd need an entire city just to house the staff. You'd need supply chains bringing food from multiple regions daily, because these women came from different cultures, with completely different dietary laws and preferences. Egyptian wives would require different food than Moabite wives. Sidonian wives would have different requirements than Ammonite wives. You'd need diplomatic protocols for managing conflicts between wives from rival nations whose fathers might be at war with each other. You'd need translators because these women spoke dozens of different languages. You'd need Egypt and Moab and Ammon and Edom and Sidon all represented under one roof. Women who worshipped different gods. Women whose fathers were enemies of each other. Women whose cultures conflicted on everything from food to clothing to worship. Do you see the impossibility? This isn't a blessing. This isn't evidence of divine favor. This is an administrative nightmare that would bankrupt any kingdom on earth. But the Bible presents it as if it's normal, as if God approved of it, as if this was just what wise and blessed kings did. And here's what they never told you in Sunday school. Here's what your pastor never mentioned. The number 1,000 in ancient Hebrew literature is not literal. It's symbolic. It's a literary device. It means uncountable. It means more than you can imagine. It's hyperbole designed to create an impression, not convey a fact. When the Bible says Goliath was 6 cubits tall, it's using symbolic measurement. When it says Methuselah lived 969 years, it's using symbolic numbers. When it says Solomon had 1,000 wives, it's using the same literary convention. The authors weren't counting actual wives. They were building a legend, and Spinoza proved this. He compared the Solomon narrative to other ancient texts from the same time period. He read Egyptian records. He studied Babylonian chronicles. He examined Assyrian annals. He searched for any mention of this supposedly world-famous king, whose wisdom drew visitors from every nation. And you know what he found? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. No mention of Solomon anywhere outside the Bible. No archaeological evidence of this magnificent kingdom. No record of this wise king whose fame supposedly spread to every corner of the known world. No tribute lists. No trade agreements. No diplomatic correspondence. The Queen of Sheba story? No Ethiopian or Arabian records mention it. And they kept extensive records. The temple that supposedly took 7 years to build with cedar from Lebanon? No Phoenician records document such a project. And the Phoenicians documented everything. The wealth that supposedly surpassed all kings? No economic evidence. It's as if this mighty kingdom never existed at all. Or, if there was a king named Solomon, he was nothing like the legend you were taught. If you ever doubted this story, even for a moment, you weren't being disrespectful to God. You weren't showing weak faith. You were being intelligent. Your mind was trying to tell you something important. It was trying to tell you that numbers matter, that logistics matter, that reality matters. But they told you to ignore your intelligence. They told you to just have faith and stop asking questions. Why? Because once you start questioning one number, once you start asking how one man could actually manage 1,000 political marriages, you start questioning everything else. You start noticing the other contradictions, you start seeing the patterns, and that's exactly what they feared. Now, here comes the second impossible truth, and this one is even more revealing. This is the truth about God warning Solomon twice, and Solomon doing it anyway. The Bible tells you that God appeared to Solomon twice, not in vague dreams, not through prophets, face-to-face, direct communication. The Creator of the universe personally visited this king on 2 separate occasions and spoke to him directly with unmistakable clarity. First time, At Gibeon, early in Solomon's reign, God appears and offers him anything in the entire world: wealth beyond measure, long life, victory over enemies, anything he could possibly want. And Solomon, supposedly showing the wisdom that would define his reign, asks for an understanding heart to govern his people. God is so pleased with this request that he grants not only the wisdom Solomon asked for, but also all the things Solomon didn't ask for: wealth, honor, long life, personal divine blessing, explicit covenant. Second time, after the temple is completed, God appears to Solomon again, and this time the message is different. God tells Solomon he has heard his prayer, that he has consecrated the temple, that his eyes and heart will be there forever. But then God issues a warning, a clear, explicit, absolutely unmistakable warning. If you or your descendants turn away from me to worship other gods, there will be severe consequences. I will cut off Israel. I will reject this temple. Israel will become a byword among all peoples. A warning so clear that no one could possibly misunderstand it. A warning delivered personally, face to face, by God Himself. Got that? God Himself, in personal conversation, warned Solomon directly about the exact sin that Solomon would later commit. Not through a prophet who might be dismissed, not through a dream that might be forgotten. Face to face, explicit, clear as day. And what does Solomon do after receiving this direct, personal, unmistakable warning from God Himself? Exactly what God warned him not to do. Not something similar, not a related sin. The exact thing. He builds altars to foreign gods, to Ashtoreth, goddess of the Sidonians, to Chemosh, the detestable god of Moab, to Molech, the abomination of the Ammonites, gods that demanded child sacrifice as part of their worship. And he doesn't build these altars secretly. He doesn't hide his idolatry. He builds them on the Mount of Olives, in direct sight of the temple he built for Yahweh. Everyone can see them. They're monuments, public declarations. Think about this carefully. If you had a personal conversation with God, if the Creator of the universe warned you directly about a specific sin, if you'd been given supernatural wisdom specifically to avoid such mistakes, would you then do exactly what you were warned against? Does that make any sense? Does that sound like wisdom? Or does it sound like two completely different stories, written by different people at different times, stitched together by later editors who didn't bother to make them consistent? Spinoza saw it immediately when he read the text without assuming it had to make sense. The Solomon of 1 Kings chapters 1 through 10 is a completely different character than the Solomon of 1 Kings chapter 11. Different personality, different priorities, different values, different relationship with God. It's as if you're reading about two entirely different people who happen to have the same name. Why? Because they were two different stories, originally. One story was written to glorify the united monarchy, to show that Israel was blessed by God, powerful, wise, wealthy. This story served the political purpose of legitimizing the monarchy. The other story was written to explain why that glorious united monarchy fell apart, why the kingdom split in two, why Israel and Judah were eventually conquered. This story served the theological purpose of showing that Israel's defeats weren't because God was weak, but because Israel broke the covenant. Different authors, different historical contexts, different agendas, different purposes. But they told you it was seamless divine revelation. They told you every word was inspired by God. They told you the contradictions were mysteries that would make sense in heaven. They told you that your inability to reconcile these contradictions was a failure of your faith, not a failure of the text. They told you that questioning was doubt, and doubt was sin. If you ever felt confused by this story, if you ever wondered how someone could have a face-to-face conversation with God and then immediately disobey, you weren't missing something. You were seeing clearly. You were thinking logically. You were noticing what was right in front of you. And they told you that seeing clearly was dangerous. And now comes the third impossible truth. This is the truth that Solomon didn't write a single word they say he wrote. The Bible makes an extraordinary claim. It says Solomon spoke 3,000 proverbs and composed 1,005 songs. It says he could teach about plants from the cedar of Lebanon to the hyssop on walls. It says he could discourse about animals, birds, reptiles, and fish. It says his wisdom surpassed all the wisdom of Egypt. This is presented as proof of his unprecedented wisdom, as evidence of God's blessing. And we have 3 books attributed to Solomon: the Book of Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, the Song of Songs. These are supposedly the surviving examples of his wisdom. And scholars have known for centuries, for literal hundreds of years, that Solomon didn't write any of them. Not one single word. The evidence is overwhelming. The language is wrong for 10th century Hebrew. The vocabulary is wrong. The grammar is wrong. Everything about these books screams that they were written hundreds of years after Solomon supposedly lived. Proverbs contains Aramaic words that didn't enter Hebrew until after the Babylonian exile, 500 years after Solomon's supposed reign. 500 years. Ecclesiastes uses Persian loanwords that didn't exist in Hebrew until the Persian period, centuries after Solomon. It discusses philosophical concepts that didn't appear in Israelite thought until contact with Greek philosophy. The entire worldview is wrong for 10th century Israel. But here's where it gets absolutely ridiculous. Some of the proverbs in the Book of Proverbs are copied, almost word for word, from an Egyptian text called the Instruction of Amenemope, written before Solomon was born. Not similar to, not inspired by, copied, translated from Egyptian into Hebrew. So the wisest man in history, the man whose wisdom supposedly surpassed Egypt, apparently plagiarized his wisdom from Egyptian sources. Does that sound like divine inspiration? Does that sound like supernatural wisdom granted by God? Or does it sound exactly like what it is? Later scribes, writing centuries after Solomon's supposed reign, needed authority for their wisdom literature. They had teachings they wanted to preserve, but they needed people to listen. They needed people to believe these weren't just human opinions. So they attached Solomon's name to their work. It's called pseudepigraphy. It was extremely common in the ancient world. Egyptian scribes did it. Greek philosophers did it. Roman writers did it. Everyone did it. It wasn't considered lying. It was considered a literary convention. But the church pretended the Bible was different, special. They claimed that when it says Solomon wrote Proverbs, Solomon actually wrote Proverbs. And they knew it wasn't true. The scholars knew. The theologians knew. The bishops knew. They had access to the same evidence. They could see the same problems. But they never told you. Why? Because if they admitted the books weren't written by their supposed authors, people would start asking what else isn't true. People would start questioning. People would start thinking for themselves. Spinoza documented this systematically throughout the Bible. He showed that most texts attributed to ancient authors were actually written centuries later. He proved it with linguistic evidence, with historical analysis. And when he published this evidence, they didn't thank him. They said, "You must be silenced, because truth is dangerous to institutions built on lies. Deep down, you already knew something wasn't right. You already felt these contradictions, but they told you those feelings were sin. They made you feel guilty for being intelligent enough to notice the obvious. Now we arrive at the fourth impossible truth. This is the truth about wealth that would collapse any economy. The Bible claims that during Solomon's reign, silver was as common as stones in Jerusalem. That precious metal was so abundant, it had become ordinary, everywhere you looked. Stop right there. Think about what that means economically. If silver becomes as common as stones, it has absolutely no value. This is the most basic economics possible. Supply and demand. Scarcity creates value. Abundance destroys it. If you flood a market with precious metals, they stop being precious. They become worthless. So either Solomon literally destroyed his own economy through hyperinflation, making trade impossible, or the story is pure fantasy. Think about what happens when currency loses value. Trade collapses because merchants won't accept worthless payment. Social order breaks down because people can't buy food. Workers revolt because wages mean nothing. But the Bible presents this as pure blessing, as if economic laws don't exist when God is involved. Here's what actually happened. Archaeologists have excavated 10th century Jerusalem extensively. They've mapped the entire city. They've analyzed every artifact, the pottery, the tools, the structures. And they found a small hilltop village. Maybe 2,000 inhabitants. No evidence of monumental architecture. No evidence of international trade networks. No evidence whatsoever of the massive wealth described. The Jerusalem of Solomon's supposed time was a provincial town, not an imperial capital. It was one small settlement among many. The archaeology doesn't lie. The stones don't have agendas. They just are what they are, and they all tell the same story. 10th century Jerusalem was small, poor, insignificant. But scribes writing centuries later needed a golden age. They needed to establish that their nation was once great, once powerful, once chosen by God, in a way no one could deny. So they invented a king so magnificent no one could question God's favor. They didn't care about archaeological evidence because they didn't know we'd someday have it. They didn't care about economic plausibility. They weren't writing history. They were writing theology. Spinoza understood this perfectly. The Bible is theology written as history, political propaganda dressed as divine revelation. It's the story a conquered people tell themselves to maintain identity and hope. If you ever felt these stories didn't make sense economically or logically, you weren't spiritually deficient. You were awake. You were using the mind you were given. And now the fifth impossible truth. This is the truth that the wisest man made the stupidest decisions imaginable. God gave Solomon wisdom beyond all men. Supernatural understanding. Direct divine gift. The Queen of Sheba was left breathless by his wisdom. But then, this same supposedly wisest man proceeded to make decisions so catastrophically stupid, they destroyed his entire kingdom in one generation. He married foreign wives specifically forbidden by God's law. Not one, not a few, hundreds of them, 700 wives, 300 concubines. And he didn't just marry them, he allowed those foreign wives to turn his heart away from Yahweh, away from the God who had given him everything, away from the God who had appeared to him twice face to face. The man with supernatural wisdom was somehow influenced away from God by his wives. He built altars to foreign gods, not small private shrines, massive public altars, to Ashtoreth, to Chemosh, to Moloch, gods that demanded child sacrifice. He built these monuments on the Mount of Olives, in direct sight of Yahweh's temple, where everyone could see his betrayal. He imposed brutal forced labor on his own people. He conscripted tens of thousands of Israelites to work on his building projects, treating them like conquered slaves. He taxed the people into poverty to fund his extravagant construction. He created such deep resentment that the moment he died, the northern tribes revolted. They refused to accept his son. They demanded the oppression end. And when his son refused, they split away entirely. The kingdom split in two and never reunited. The united monarchy lasted exactly 2 generations, David and Solomon. Then permanent division, permanent weakness. Both kingdoms eventually conquered because division made them vulnerable. This is wisdom. This is supernatural understanding from God. Let's be practical. A wise ruler builds alliances that strengthen his kingdom. Solomon's alliances destroyed it. A wise ruler manages resources for long-term stability. Solomon's projects bankrupted the nation. A wise ruler maintains the loyalty of his people. Solomon's policies made them hate the throne. Every single major decision led to disaster. Spinoza saw it clearly. If Solomon was truly wise, his kingdom would have flourished. If he was blessed, his legacy would have endured. If he was devoted, he wouldn't have died worshipping demons. The only way this makes sense is if Solomon was never meant to be a historical figure. He was a literary device, a theological argument. First half of the story. Look how blessed we were when we obeyed God. Second half. Look what happened when we turned away. It's structure. It's theology. It's not history. It's not biography. But they taught you it was literal truth. They taught you to twist your mind, trying to explain the unexplainable. If you ever wondered how wisdom and stupidity could coexist to this extreme, you weren't confused. You were right to question. Here comes the 6th impossible truth. This is the truth that Solomon cared more about his own glory than God's, and the Bible's own account proves it. The text tells you Solomon built God's temple in 7 years, a massive structure. Cedar from Lebanon, gold overlay, bronze pillars, so magnificent that God's glory filled it. 7 years for the house of God. But then it tells you Solomon spent 13 years building his own palace, his personal residence, almost twice as long. 7 years for God's temple. 13 years for Solomon's palace. Think about what that reveals. Does that sound like a man devoted to God above all? Does that sound like humility? Or does it sound like a king more concerned with his own magnificence? The text itself betrays the character it's trying to glorify. It shows you Solomon's true priorities. But here's an even bigger problem. The architectural descriptions don't match any known building style from 10th century BCE. The measurements would create a structure that wouldn't be stable. The techniques described didn't exist yet. The materials would have required trade networks that didn't exist. The temple as described could not have been built when the Bible claims. So when was it built? Most scholars agree, 8th or 7th century BCE at earliest, hundreds of years after Solomon. And the description was written even later, during the Babylonian exile, by scribes who never saw the original. They were describing not what was, but what they wished had been. Not history. Theological ideal. Why does this matter? Because the temple was everything. It was the center of worship, proof of God's presence, justification for the priesthood's power and wealth. And if Solomon didn't build it, if the story is retroactive invention, then what else is invented? What else were you taught as divine truth that was actually political fiction? Spinoza asked that question publicly, and religious authorities couldn't let him live freely after asking it. Because once you ask it about one thing, you inevitably ask it about everything. And the entire structure of religious authority begins to crumble. And now we come to the seventh and final impossible truth. This is the one that reveals everything. This is the truth that they needed Solomon to be both hero and villain simultaneously. The Bible ends Solomon's story abruptly. He did evil in the sight of the Lord. God was angry. The kingdom would be torn away. And then Solomon simply dies. No repentance, no redemption, no final conversation with God. Just death, judgment, divine anger. But here's what's bizarre. Despite building altars to child-sacrificing demons, despite turning from God after 2 face-to-face visits, despite leading all Israel into idolatry, despite ignoring direct divine warnings, despite committing every sin imaginable for a king of Israel, Solomon is still called blessed in Jewish and Christian tradition, still called wise, still held up as the golden standard of Israel's glory. Why? Why condemn his actions but preserve his legend? Why make him both hero and villain in the same breath? Because the scribes who wrote this needed him to be both things simultaneously. They needed him to serve contradictory theological purposes. They needed him to be a hero so people would believe Israel was once great, so they'd have hope that greatness could return, so they'd see God's favor as real. But they also needed him to be a warning, so people would understand why that greatness was lost, so they'd accept that the monarchy was gone, so they'd believe defeat was punishment for sin, not proof that God was weak. It's political theology written by people in exile, people desperately trying to explain why they were defeated, why they lost everything, why God seemed to have abandoned them. The answer they created? We were once great. God did bless us. Solomon was real and magnificent, but we turned away, we sinned. And this is the consequence. Solomon isn't a historical figure. He's a narrative device, a way to make sense of unbearable trauma while preserving faith. And Spinoza proved all this by doing something beautifully simple. He read the text carefully. He compared it to other ancient texts. He applied basic logic. He asked whether the stories made sense on their own terms. He checked for external confirmation. He looked for the seams where different sources were stitched together. And the answer was clear. No, these stories don't make sense as history. Yes, they contradict themselves repeatedly. Yes, they violate basic economics, politics, human psychology. Yes, they contain anachronisms proving they were written centuries after the events. Yes, they make claims no external source confirms. They are legends, myths, teaching stories, theology dressed as history. But they told you it was all literal truth, exact history, perfect divine revelation. They told you doubting any detail was sin. They told you questioning showed a rebellious spirit. They told you to accept it all on their authority and stop thinking. So let me ask you now, after hearing these 7 impossible truths, after seeing the contradictions laid out, after examining the clear evidence of fabrication, do you still think you were wrong to doubt? Do you still think your questions showed weak faith? Or do you finally see that you were lied to? Not because God isn't real, not because spirituality is meaningless, but because institutions need control. They need you to believe questioning is dangerous. They need you to accept authority without evidence. And the easiest way to maintain that control? Take ancient texts declare them inerrant, and punish anyone who points out the problems. Spinoza spent his entire adult life isolated, poor, and hunted because he refused to pretend, because he valued truth over comfort, because he believed freedom began with honest inquiry, because he thought that God, if God exists, would prefer honest questions to dishonest certainty. They cursed him in an elaborate ceremony. They banned every book he wrote. They destroyed his reputation so thoroughly his name became synonymous with heresy for centuries. They made sure even mentioning his ideas could get you in trouble, but they couldn't destroy what he proved. They couldn't erase the contradictions he documented. They couldn't make the archaeological absence suddenly appear. And now, more than 300 years after his death, everything he said has been confirmed by archaeology, by linguistics, by textual criticism, by historical research. Every major university, even religious ones, teaches that the Bible wasn't written the way tradition claims. Every serious scholar acknowledges the contradictions and anachronisms Spinoza first documented. The scholars know. The professors know. The theologians know. The seminary teachers know. But most churches still teach the old stories as literal history. Still tell children Solomon was a real wise king, blessed by God. Still present the Bible as if God wrote it word for word. Still shame people for asking questions. Still present doubt as the enemy of faith. Why? Because once people start questioning one story with clear evidence, they start questioning all the stories. And institutions built entirely on claims of unquestionable authority cannot survive widespread critical questioning. Their entire structure collapses, so they keep teaching myths as history. They keep punishing doubters. They keep making you feel guilty for noticing what's right in front of your eyes. But you don't have to carry that guilt anymore. You don't have to carry that shame. You don't have to pretend the impossible is possible. You don't have to twist your mind into knots, trying to make contradictions make sense. You don't have to believe that asking honest questions will condemn you. You're allowed to say, "This doesn't add up." You're allowed to say, "I was taught things that aren't true." You're allowed to say, "The evidence doesn't support these claims." You're allowed to let go of the fear that questioning will destroy your soul. Because the truth is this: Spinoza wasn't rejecting God or spirituality. He was rejecting lies told about God. He wasn't destroying faith. He was destroying institutions that weaponized faith for power and control. He wasn't promoting atheism. He was promoting intellectual honesty. And you can do the same. You can honor truth wherever it leads. You can seek wisdom honestly. You can be deeply spiritual without swallowing every impossible claim. You can recognize the Bible is a human document, written by humans for human purposes, and still find profound meaning in it. You can appreciate the wisdom in Proverbs without believing Solomon wrote it. You can value the insights in Ecclesiastes without pretending it's divinely dictated. You can recognize the beauty in Song of Songs without treating it as supernatural revelation. You can separate the message from the mythology. The real question was never whether Solomon had 1,000 wives. The real question is why you were taught to believe it without evidence. The real question is why religious authorities made you feel guilty for noticing contradictions. The real question is, are you going to keep pretending? Or are you finally ready to be free? Spinoza chose freedom knowing it would cost him everything: his community, his family, his security, his reputation, his comfort, his safety, and he chose it anyway because he understood something profound. That living honestly with real questions is infinitely better than living comfortably with lies you're forced to pretend are true. That doubt born from genuine intelligence is far more valuable than certainty born from fear and social pressure. If this gave you even a small measure of freedom from guilt or fear, don't let it stay only with you. Share it. Let others know they're not alone in their doubts. Let them know that questioning isn't rebellion against God. It's intellectual honesty. It's using the mind you were given. Leave your location below. Let's see how many of us are waking up at the same time. Let's build a real community of people who value truth over comfortable tradition, honesty over conformity, freedom over fear-based control. You were never wrong to doubt these impossible stories. You were just honest and intelligent enough to notice the problems. And that's not a sin. That's not spiritual weakness. That's not rebellion. That's wisdom.